Long before China became an empire, before dynasties rose and fell, the world itself was said to be born from chaos. Gods walked beside mortals. The sky was broken and remade, and the fate of the land rested in the hands of legendary rulers. From Pangu, who split heaven from earth, to Nüwa, who repaired the sky, to the Yellow Emperor who united the tribes, and Yu the Great, the man who tamed the floods and reshaped the rivers themselves. These are not just myths. They are the stories that built the foundations of Chinese civilization. And tonight, we journey through the legends where myth becomes history. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we journey into one of the most ancient and richly layered traditions of storytelling in human history, the vast and mysterious world of Chinese mythology. For thousands of years, these stories have been whispered beside hearth fires, carved into scrolls, painted on temple walls, and passed from generation to generation like sacred treasures. They are tales of creation and destruction, of cosmic battles and quiet wisdom, of divine beings who shaped the heavens and the earth long before humanity ever walked beneath the sky. Within these myths, we encounter dragons that coil through clouds, immortal sages who wander between worlds, and powerful gods who govern the forces of nature. We will meet culture heroes who tamed wild rivers and taught humanity the secrets of civilization: how to write, how to farm, how to live together in harmony. These stories are not merely entertainment. They are reflections of how ancient people understood the universe, how they explained the rhythms of nature, the turning of the seasons, and humanity's fragile place within a vast and mysterious cosmos. As always, before we begin, I would love to know something about you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Perhaps you're lying comfortably in bed with the lights dimmed, letting the quiet settle around you. Or maybe you've simply carved out a few peaceful moments at the end of a long day. Wherever you are, I hope this journey into ancient myth allows your mind to slow down, your breath to deepen, and your thoughts to drift gently into the timeless rhythm of storytelling. Tonight's tale is older than kingdoms, older than written history itself. It is a story carried in memory across thousands of years. And tonight, it belongs to you, the beginning of everything. In the beginning, there was nothing that we would recognize as a world. No sky stretched overhead. No earth lay beneath unseen feet. There was no sun to illuminate the passing of days, and no moon to mark the slow rhythm of months. There were no mountains, no oceans, no forests, no stars. There was only darkness. But it was not the simple darkness of night. It was something deeper, a boundless, swirling chaos where light and shadow had not yet separated, a place where form had not yet taken shape, where direction had no meaning, and where time itself seemed suspended. It was as though the universe slept. Within that endless void, ancient storytellers imagined a vast cosmic egg drifting silently through the emptiness. Inside that egg lay everything that would one day exist: stone and water, wind and flame, life and death, the seeds of every mountain, every river, every living creature yet to come. For 18,000 years, this immense egg floated in the dark. Inside, the forces of creation stirred slowly, like dreams forming in the mind of the universe itself. And then one day the silence broke. Without warning, a crack split across the shell. From that fracture burst the first breath of wind, the first shimmer of light, and the first groaning movement of a being too immense to remain confined. From the broken chaos rose Pangu, the first living being and the greatest of all giants. His form was colossal, so enormous that his head pressed against the curved shell above him, while his feet planted firmly into the depths below. In his mighty hands he held a great axe, forged from the same primal substance that had once filled the universe. And with one tremendous strike, Pangu swung the axe. The sound of the blow echoed like thunder through an empty sky. The cosmic egg shattered, the separation of heaven and earth. From the broken shell, the universe began to take shape. The lighter, pure elements drifted upward, rising higher and higher until they formed the heavens. The heavier elements sank downward, settling into the earth. But the newborn sky and the newborn earth were unstable. They threatened to collapse back together, crushing the fragile space between them. So Pangu stepped forward. Planting his feet firmly upon the earth, he lifted his shoulders against the sky. With unimaginable strength, he forced them apart. Thus began his long vigil. Each day, the sky rose 10 feet higher. Each day, the earth grew 10 feet thicker. And each day, Pangu himself grew taller, expanding with the growing world, so that the heavens and earth would never collide again. Though there was still no sun or moon to measure time, ages passed. Mountains slowly rose beneath his feet. The winds stirred across the forming land. The faint sparks of future stars began to shimmer above his head. For 18,000 years, Pangu held heaven and earth apart. His breath became the winds that swept across the young world. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. His sweat fell as rain upon the soil below. Alone in the silent universe, the giant stood as the living pillar that supported creation itself. No eyes yet existed to witness his labor. No voice yet lived to praise his sacrifice. But the memory of his strength would live forever in the bones of the mountains and the endless vault of the sky. The death of the first giant. At last, after countless millennia, the work was complete. The sky stood high and firm above the world. The earth stretched wide and steady below. Pangu's task was finished. But the endless strain of holding apart heaven and earth had drained even the strength of the first giant. Slowly, his immense power began to fade. The winds that once roared from his lungs softened into gentle breezes. The thunder in his voice faded to distant echoes, and the giant who had shaped the universe sank slowly to his knees. His breathing grew shallow. His great luminous eyes dimmed like fading stars. With no companions to mourn him and no creatures yet alive to speak his name, Pangu lay down between the sky he had lifted and the earth he had steadied. And there, in the silence of the newborn world, the first being died. But his death was not an end. It was the final act of creation, the world born from a giant. As Pangu's body returned to the earth, it transformed into the very fabric of the world. His final breath became the wind that forever moves across the land. His voice turned into thunder rolling across distant mountains. His left eye rose into the sky and became the sun. His right eye became the moon, cool and luminous in the night. His hair and beard scattered across the heavens as the stars, sparkling like embers from the forge of creation. His blood flowed outward, forming the rivers and oceans. His flesh became the soil from which forests and fields would grow. His bones hardened into the mountains, their peaks reaching like spears into the sky. Even the tiny creatures that had lived within his vast hair were scattered across the earth and transformed into the animals that would roam forests and plains. Nothing of Pangu was wasted. His body became the world itself. There was no tomb built in his honor, because the earth itself was his resting place. The mountains were his bones. The rivers were his veins. The sky was the great dome he had once held aloft with his own strength. And so the age of Pangu ended. But the age of the world had only just begun. A silent world. Yet even after the giant's sacrifice, the world remained empty. The rivers flowed across bare stones. The winds moved across silent valleys. The sun and moon traveled their endless paths across a sky unbroken by wings. It was a beautiful world, but it was also a lonely one. For what is a world without life to see it? What are mountains without travelers? What are rivers without those who drink from them? And it was into this vast and silent land that Nüwa came, the mother goddess, the gentle creator, the weaver of destinies yet to be. Unlike Pangu, who had burst forth from chaos, Nüwa seemed to arrive as though she had always existed, wandering quietly at the edge of creation until the moment the world needed her. She walked across the wide earth, studying its valleys and mountains. Her gaze lingered on the winding rivers, and the still lakes that mirrored the sky. And as she walked through that silent world, she felt something missing. Something the earth itself seemed to be waiting for. Life. We left the newborn earth in silence, its mountains standing tall but lifeless, its rivers whispering to no one, its vast plains untouched by footsteps. The world was beautiful, but incomplete, like a painting whose colors had been laid down, but whose story had not yet begun. In that quiet and waiting world, a new presence arrived. She was known as Nüwa, the gentle mother goddess, the quiet architect of life itself. Unlike the mighty giant Pangu, who had been born from the violent splitting of chaos, Nüwa seemed almost to drift into existence, as though she had always been wandering just beyond the edges of the world, waiting for the moment when her presence would be needed. When she first stepped onto the earth, she did not rush to shape it. Instead, she walked. She wandered slowly across valleys and along the banks of newly formed rivers. Her eyes followed the winding paths of streams, watched mist gather around mountain peaks, and studied the reflections of the sun and moon upon the still surfaces of lakes. Everywhere she looked, she saw beauty, the grand beauty of a world freshly made. Yet something was missing. The forests stood silent, their branches unmoving except for the wind. The plains stretched endlessly without the sound of footsteps. The sky carried the light of the sun and moon, but no voice rose to greet them. It was a world without laughter, without stories, without memory. And Nüwa felt that absence deeply. It was like an emptiness in her heart, a quiet ache that told her the world was meant to hold something more. So she decided to change it. One day she came to the edge of a river where the water moved slowly through soft yellow earth. The clay there was smooth and cool beneath her fingers. Kneeling beside the water, she gathered a handful of the damp clay and began to shape it carefully. She worked slowly, thoughtfully. With patient hands she formed a small figure, upright like herself, with arms that could reach, legs that could walk, and a face that could look out upon the world. She shaped eyes so it could see the beauty of mountains and rivers. She formed a mouth so it could speak and sing. She molded hands strong enough to build and create. When the figure was complete, she held it gently before her. Then she breathed into it. The clay stirred. Its chest rose slightly, drawing its very first breath. Its eyes blinked open, adjusting to the light of a world that had never before been seen by mortal eyes. The first human had come into existence. The sound of that first breath was small and uncertain, yet it was the first living voice ever to break the silence of the earth. Nüwa smiled softly. She placed the new being upon the ground, and slowly, unsteadily, it took its first steps. Bare feet pressed into the soil, leaving the very first human footprints upon the land. Encouraged by what she had created, Nüwa continued her work. Again and again she gathered clay from the riverbank, shaping more figures with careful hands. Each one she formed slightly different from the others. Some she made tall, others short. Some she gave quick laughter and bright eyes. Others she shaped thoughtful and quiet. Every one of them she gifted with a mind capable of remembering, imagining, and dreaming. Yet as the days passed, Nüwa began to realize something. The world was enormous. Its plains stretched farther than the eye could see. Its forests covered mountains and valleys beyond counting. Creating humans one by one, with such careful attention, would take countless ages before the earth was truly filled with life. Even a goddess could grow tired, so she devised another way. Nüwa took a long cord of vine and dipped it into the yellow clay beside the river. When the vine was heavy with mud, she lifted it high into the air and swung it outward. Droplets of clay scattered across the land. Wherever each drop struck the ground, something remarkable happened. A human sprang to life. Across the fields and hillsides, new people appeared, men, women, and children rising from the earth itself. Some were formed from the finest clay, smooth and strong, while others came from rougher mud, destined to live harder lives. In a single sweeping motion, the once empty world became alive with human voices. People walked across the plains. Fires began to glow against the darkness of night. Families gathered together for warmth and safety. For the first time, laughter drifted across the wind. Nüwa watched them quietly from afar. Her heart was filled with a gentle pride as she saw humans discovering the world she had given them. They drank from rivers, gathered fruits from wild trees, and built simple shelters from branches and mud. Though they did not yet know her name, they felt her presence. Sometimes it was sensed in the calm warmth of a summer breeze. Sometimes in the strange stillness before a storm. For a time, the world lived in peace. But far above the earth, in the high halls of heaven, conflict was beginning to grow. Among the gods, pride and rivalry stirred like gathering thunderclouds. One story tells that the powerful water god Gong Gong, proud and fiercely ambitious, desired dominion over heaven and earth. Another tale claims it was merely a bitter contest between him and the fiery god Jerome, each determined to prove his strength. Whatever the cause, their struggle soon erupted into a war so violent that even the foundations of the world trembled. Mountains shook. Storms raged across the sky. When Gong Gong finally realized he had been defeated, his rage became uncontrollable. In a moment of furious despair, he hurled himself headlong against Mount Bujo, one of the colossal pillars that supported the heavens themselves. The impact was catastrophic. The pillar cracked. Then it shattered. In an instant, the order Pangu had fought for thousands of years to establish began to collapse. The sky itself tore open. From the wound in the heavens poured flames and torrents of water. Forests burned as fire rained from above. Rivers burst their banks and surged across the land, flooding villages and fields. Mountains tilted and crumbled. The sun and moon wavered in their paths. The stars trembled as if the night itself might fall apart. Humans fled in terror, climbing hills or hiding in caves as chaos swept across the world. Animals ran wild through the forests, driven mad by smoke and thunder. It was as though the universe had been thrown back into the violent chaos of its birth. When Nüwa saw the destruction threatening her children, sorrow filled her heart. But sorrow quickly turned to determination. No other power was coming to save the world, so she would do it herself. She journeyed to the far corners of the earth in search of 5 sacred stones, each holding the essence of a different element. Red, yellow, blue, white, black. She gathered them and built a great furnace whose flames burned brighter than any fire the world had yet seen. Within it she melted the stones until their colors flowed together like rivers of glowing light. Then she carried the molten mixture high into the sky. Standing before the torn heavens, she poured the shimmering substance across the wound. Slowly the breach closed, the glowing patch spreading like a rainbow across the sky. But the heavens were still unstable. The pillar of Mount Bujo lay shattered. To solve this, Nüwa sought out a great cosmic turtle whose shell was older than mountains. After slaying it, she cut away its 4 immense legs and placed them at the 4 corners of the world to support the sky. At last, heaven stood firm once more. Even then her work was not finished. Floodwaters still surged through valleys, and fires still raged across the forests. Nüwa built dams of reeds and earth to contain the waters. She calmed the fires until they faded into ash. She drove away the monstrous beasts that had appeared during the chaos, forcing them back into the deepest forests. Only after all this did she finally rest. Her body was exhausted, her clothes burned and torn, her hands scarred from the labor. Slowly the people emerged from hiding, staring up at the sky in awe. It was whole again, and high above them shone the faint colors of the stones Nüwa had melted to mend it. The world had been saved, not by war, nor by thunderous gods, but by the quiet determination of one who loved it too deeply to let it perish. Nüwa did not build temples to herself. She asked for no throne. She simply walked away, returning to her quiet wandering. Yet the sky above humanity would forever carry the memory of her work, a subtle patch of color, a reminder that the heavens had once been broken and that a mother had repaired them. Even after the world settled, the marks of that great catastrophe remained. The sky now leaned slightly toward the northwest, and the earth tilted toward the southeast. Rivers began to flow more strongly in that direction, carving valleys across the land. Seasons changed. Winds grew harsher, but humans adapted. They learned to build stronger homes, to work together, and to form communities. They wove baskets, fired clay into pottery, and raised their children beneath the repaired sky. And though the details of Nüwa's deeds would fade with time, humanity would always carry the quiet memory of a creator who once walked the earth, shaping life from clay and saving the world from ruin. As the years passed after the great repair of the heavens, the people slowly began to build lives beneath the sky that Nüwa had restored. Villages appeared along rivers. Paths formed between hills. The once empty world now carried the sound of human voices. Yet the influence of Nüwa remained woven quietly into their lives. Without ever proclaiming laws from a throne, her presence shaped the way people thought about the balance of the world. Communities began to form customs that reflected the lessons she had gently planted among them. Wastefulness came to be frowned upon. Greed was condemned, not merely because it harmed others, but because it disturbed the delicate harmony between humanity and the land that sustained it. Those who cared for the forests, who protected rivers from pollution, and treated the earth with patience were respected. Those who hoarded or destroyed without thought were judged harshly by their neighbors. In this way, the values of a wandering goddess slowly became the quiet foundations of human society. But Nüwa herself carried a deeper understanding of the world's fragility. During her long journeys across the land, she sometimes encountered silent reminders of the catastrophe that had nearly destroyed everything. In lonely valleys or along distant shores, she would find the bones of those who had perished during the great floods and fires. Their remains had been carried far from their homes by the raging waters. Whenever she discovered them, Nüwa would kneel beside the scattered bones and gently cover them with soil. She whispered soft words of farewell, words meant not for human ears but for the wind itself. Even a goddess could mourn. She also saw the new hardships her people faced under the altered sky. In the northern lands, winters grew longer and harsher. The sun traveled lower across the horizon, leaving the earth cold and dim for many months. Snow buried villages, and hunger sometimes stalked the settlements. Far to the south, rivers swollen with rain occasionally burst their banks. Floodwaters would rush through fields and homes, carrying away the work of entire seasons. Nüwa understood that these trials were part of the price of saving the world. The tilt of the sky, caused by the imperfect pillars of the cosmic turtle, could not be undone. To attempt another great alteration might shatter the balance of the universe once again. So instead of changing the world, she chose to strengthen the people who lived within it. In many old tales told in remote villages, it is said that Nüwa sometimes appeared in disguise. She would approach lonely homes at dusk, presenting herself as a weary traveler seeking shelter for the night. The families who welcomed her would sit beside the hearth fire while she spoke quietly about practical things. She might teach them how to catch fish during the coldest months when other food grew scarce. She might show them how to dig deep pits in the cool earth where grain could be stored safely through the heat of summer. Sometimes she would teach them how to watch the stars and understand when the rains were coming. She never stayed long. At dawn she would quietly depart, leaving no sign of who she truly was. Yet the family would often discover a small gift waiting behind her. Perhaps a basket of fruit from a grove far beyond their valley. Perhaps a jar filled with fresh water, even during times of drought. These quiet acts of kindness bound Nüwa to humanity in a unique way. She was not a distant ruler commanding worship. She was something gentler, a protector who cared for her creations as a mother cares for her children. And in truth, her greatest gift to humanity was not any single tool or piece of knowledge. It was an idea. The people remembered the terrible day when the sky had broken and chaos had poured into the world. But they also remembered that the world had been repaired, not by an army of gods, not by divine thunder, but by the patient hands of someone who loved them enough to act. From this memory came a powerful lesson. The world was not unchangeable. Even disasters could be repaired if courage and determination were strong enough. Parents told this story to their children. Those children later told it to their own sons and daughters. With every retelling, the spirit of Nüwa's sacrifice settled deeper into human memory. They came to believe that the labor of a few could preserve the lives of many, and that love, when joined with resolve, could stand even against the collapse of the heavens themselves. Over generations, the visible colors of Nüwa's repair faded into the endless blue of the sky. Yet her influence remained in subtler ways, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the tilt of the heavens, and in the flowing paths of rivers across the land. The world was no longer perfect, but it was alive, and it endured. In time, Nüwa herself slowly passed from the realm of daily life into the realm of legend. Her name survived in the stories of wandering storytellers, and her image lived in the collective memory of the people she had created. She had never asked to be worshipped, yet humans, remembering how close the world had come to destruction, began offering prayers and gifts in her honor. Because deep in their hearts they understood a simple truth. Without her, the world itself might never have survived. The age of Fuxi. Many generations after the sky had been repaired and the rivers once again knew their banks, humanity was still young. Though people possessed voices, hands, and memory, they had not yet learned how to fully use these gifts. They lived much as animals lived. Small groups wandered beneath the open sky, moving constantly in search of food. When storms arrived, they scattered in fear. When winter winds blew across the land, they crouched in shallow caves or hollow trees. Their knowledge was small, and survival was uncertain. They ate fruits torn from branches, roots pulled from the soil, and raw meat stripped from bone. When food was scarce, arguments broke out quickly. There were no clear rules separating bravery from cruelty. The strong took what they could. The weak endured what they must. At night, their fires often died before dawn because no one knew how to keep a flame alive through the darkness. It was a world full of sunlight, yet poor in wisdom, a beginning without direction. And into that uncertain age came a figure remembered by history and myth alike, Fuxi. Unlike the towering heroes of earlier stories, Fuxi was not remembered for overwhelming strength or divine fury. Instead, he was known for something quieter. Patience. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where others saw wildness, he saw potential waiting to be guided. The storytellers say that Fuxi possessed the calm nature of deep water and the careful observation of someone who reads the shoreline by watching the bending of reeds in the wind. When he walked among the early people, he did not behave like a conqueror. He did not command them. He listened. He watched their struggles closely. He learned where hunger hurt the most and where fear most often turned neighbors against one another. And then he began with the smallest but most important changes. First, he taught them the secret of fire. He showed them how to keep a glowing coal alive from night to morning. With patience, he demonstrated how a single ember could be fed gently until it blossomed again into a steady flame. Once the people understood this, he taught them something equally important. Food did not have to be eaten raw. He showed them how to place meat upon warm stones beside the fire. Slowly the flesh softened, its juices strengthening the body rather than spreading sickness. Those who ate cooked food began to feel healthier and stronger. Illnesses grew less common. Hunger became easier to endure. Because of this simple change, days became longer and more productive. People no longer spent every moment desperately searching for their next meal. and nights became safer as fires burned steadily, keeping cold and predators at a respectful distance. Once the people had secured their food, Fushi turned his attention to another struggle: fishing. He had watched many people standing beside rivers, clawing helplessly at the water with bare hands. Most of the time they caught nothing. So he gathered vines and fibers and patiently wove them together into a patterned net. When he dragged the net through the water and lifted it again, it came up heavy with writhing silver fish. The people were amazed. For the first time they saw that thought and creativity could multiply human strength far beyond what muscles alone could achieve. From rivers, Fushi turned his gaze toward the silent fields. He taught people to observe the cycles of the seasons. Instead of stripping the land bare in a single greedy harvest, he showed them how to plant seeds carefully in the soil and wait for the earth to answer with new growth. He helped them shape the first simple tools, wooden handles with stone blades that could cut soil and prepare fields. He also encouraged them to tame animals rather than endlessly chase them. Gradually, goats became accustomed to human settlements. Dogs learned to guard homes instead of fearing them. From these new partnerships came milk in the mornings, protection at night, and warm clothing during winter. But Fushi understood something important. Once hunger was tamed, another danger would appear. When humans live close together, jealousy and anger can grow quickly. So he created rules to guide human relationships. He introduced the idea of marriage, two people willingly joining their lives together. He spoke of family as branches growing from the same tree. He forbade the taking of women by force and the stealing of food from neighbors. Punishments were established for those who ignored these rules, not out of cruelty, but because Fushi understood that trust is the foundation of any community. Without trust, no village could survive. And slowly the people changed. Those who once met only in desperate competition now gathered peacefully around shared fires. At those fires, Fushi taught them to remember the day's work and promise cooperation for the next day. He taught them songs so that children could learn the new traditions quickly. He taught them to bury their dead with care, transforming grief into remembrance rather than fear. And each morning he encouraged them to lift their eyes toward the sky and offer the first smoke of the cooking fire to the unseen powers above. Because he understood something deeply true about human nature. A people who think only of themselves will eventually become as wild as beasts once again. But a people who remember gratitude, responsibility, and cooperation can build a civilization strong enough to endure for generations. Yet Fushi understood something fundamental about human nature. A society cannot be built only upon hunger satisfied and tools placed in capable hands. For even when bellies are full, another struggle begins, the struggle within the human heart. He often told the people that when a man allows anger to settle inside him like unrefined or buried in stone, it will weigh down his spirit and cloud his judgment. But when a person learns to temper that inner metal, like a blacksmith refining iron in the fire, his hands grow steadier upon the plow, and his voice becomes calmer when speaking before the council. And so Fushi encouraged the people to shape not only their tools and homes, but their own character. Gradually, the wandering bands that had once drifted across the land began to transform. Families gathered together and formed clans. Where once there had been chaotic shouting and sudden fights, now gatherings were held in circles where elders spoke and decisions were made with patience. The people who had once moved across the earth like leaves swept along by a flood began instead to plant wooden posts in the ground and claim a place as their own. Distance itself began to change its meaning. Where once the hills and rivers had been obstacles to survive, they now became fields to cultivate and roads to travel. Paths connected villages, and travelers carried news, salt, and stories from one settlement to another. Slowly, the wildness of early humanity softened. But such change never arrives without resistance. There were still those who rejected the new order. Some mocked the idea of marriage, claiming that no rope should bind a person's freedom. Others crept through villages at night, stealing from granaries beneath the cover of darkness. They laughed at the thought that an oath spoken before witnesses could ever be stronger than a spear held in a warrior's hand. Fushi did not answer their defiance with rage. He did not strike them down with divine fury. Instead, he answered with something far more powerful: steady and unwavering justice. When wrongdoing occurred, his first demand was always restitution. Those who had stolen were required to return what they had taken, and more besides. Those who harmed another were expected to repair the damage they had caused to the community. Only when a person refused every chance at reconciliation did Fushi impose the harshest penalty: exile. He often stood in the center of the village marketplace, planting his staff firmly into the dusty earth while heated arguments raged around him. There he spoke calmly, sometimes for hours. He reminded angry men that their children would drink from the same well the next morning, that their families would walk the same roads in winter and summer alike, that no village could survive if neighbors treated one another as enemies. Slowly, tempers cooled. Little by little, fear lost its grip on daily life. In its place grew something new, discipline born from fairness. The people learned that law applied equally to friend and rival alike. And beneath this shelter of justice, the earliest seeds of culture began to grow. As evenings settled over the villages, music sometimes drifted through the air. The soft trembling notes of simple instruments echoed across the fields at dusk. Stories were exchanged beside cooking fires in return for bowls of millet or dried fish. A craftsman might carve a small figure from antler and leave it beside a river path simply because the act of creation pleased him. Such small gestures marked the beginning of something remarkable. Human life was no longer focused solely on survival. It had begun to contain beauty. When the villages had grown stable, when the nets brought reliable fish from the rivers and the fields yielded grain, Fushi turned his thoughts beyond the immediate struggles of daily life. He began to wonder about something deeper. He often sat beside the river in silence, watching the water flow past. Sometimes he stared so long that the rippling surface became still in his eyes, reflecting not his own face but something greater, patterns hidden beneath the world itself. It seemed to him that the forces of nature, wind, water, fire, thunder, must speak a language older than human words. If that language could be understood, perhaps people could better live in harmony with the world. And so Fushi resolved to translate the silent language of the universe into symbols that humans could remember. One morning, as the mist lay low upon the yellow river, a strange vision appeared. The water stirred, and from its depths emerged a creature unlike anything the people had ever seen. It was neither horse nor dragon, yet it carried the grace of both. Its body shimmered with scales that reflected the pale light of dawn. Across its back lay an intricate pattern of dark and light markings, arranged like a mysterious lattice. The creature did not speak. It simply passed before Fushi and vanished again into the river. But the pattern upon its back remained burned into his memory. In that moment, Fushi understood something profound. The universe does not shout its truths. It arranges them quietly. Returning to his people, Fushi carried no physical treasure, no stone, no artifact, no captured creature. Instead, he carried knowledge. He began drawing simple lines upon pieces of bark and polished bone. Some lines were solid, others were broken. These markings represented opposing forces, light and dark, strength and yielding, certainty and change. From these simple strokes, he built combinations of 3 lines. Soon 8 unique symbols emerged, each representing a fundamental pattern of nature. He named them for the great forces that shaped the world: heaven, earth, thunder, wind, water, fire, mountain, lake. These became known as the 8 trigrams. Through them, Fushi taught the people to observe the rhythms of the natural world. Farmers learned when to plant and harvest. Fishermen studied tides and weather. Leaders consulted the patterns before making difficult decisions. Rather than asking whether fortune would suddenly arrive, they learned to recognize what events were already approaching. Over time, the trigrams became tools of reflection and wisdom. When villages debated whether to clear a forest for farmland or shift their fields closer to the river, the elders studied the patterns. Many disasters were avoided simply because people paused to think before acting. But Fushi did not stop there. Seeing how symbols could preserve patterns, he realized they might also preserve memory. Hunters had long scratched simple marks onto wood to count their catches. Fushi gathered these early markings and began shaping them into something greater. Gradually, the first forms of writing emerged. For the first time, a person's words could travel farther than their voice. A promise carved into wood could survive anger and be remembered later. Songs could be written down and sung by people who had never met the original singer. Writing became a bridge between generations. Through it, knowledge could travel across time itself. Finally, Fushi turned his attention to something even more subtle, the human spirit. One evening, he placed a zither across his knees and plucked its strings. The clear notes drifted into the night air, gentle and calm. It was among the first deliberate music created purely for beauty. The people listened in silence. Soon others began experimenting with rhythm and melody. Songs emerged for planting crops, for mourning the dead, and for celebrating harvest festivals. Music taught patience and harmony. Through it, people learned to endure hardship together. Yet Fushi always offered a warning alongside every gift. Patterns could guide the wise, but they could also mislead the proud. He reminded those who studied the trigrams that symbols reveal possibilities, not destiny. He cautioned scribes that written words can illuminate truth, but also distort it if followed blindly. And so he taught one final lesson. Knowledge is a tool. Like a blade, it can build or destroy depending on the hand that wields it. And humanity, still young beneath the repaired heavens, was only beginning to learn how to carry such tools wisely. Fushi often reminded those who practiced music that beauty must remain simple. A melody, he would say, is like a guest who enters a home seeking warmth and company. If the hall is filled with too many decorations, too much noise, and too much pride, the guest will grow tired and leave. So he urged his musicians to play with restraint. Let the notes breathe. Let silence have its place between sounds. Let music remain something that belongs to the heart rather than to vanity. In this way, he protected the young communities from the dangers that often accompany growing knowledge. Cleverness, if left unchecked, can easily grow into arrogance. But Fushi understood that pride is not best cured by scolding or humiliation. Instead, he guided people gently. He encouraged laughter. He reminded them to return their attention to their work, to the land, and to one another. And through this quiet wisdom, the people learned humility without ever feeling the sting of contempt. Years passed. By the final years of Fushi's long life, the trigrams had become familiar symbols across every settlement. They were drawn beside hearths, scratched into wooden tablets, and consulted by elders whenever difficult decisions arose. Meanwhile, the earliest written records, simple stitched sheets of bark or bone, began to accumulate in woven baskets stored in council houses. Human memory had finally begun to live outside the fragile boundaries of the human mind. One evening, as the golden light of sunset touched the waters of the Yellow River, Fushi returned once more to the place where so many of his insights had begun. He sat quietly upon the riverbank. The great river spoke in many voices. At some bends it roared as water struck against hidden stones. At shallow crossings it whispered softly around the feet of travelers. And where the river widened into calm waters, it moved silently, like a vast animal resting beneath the sky. Listening to these sounds, Fushi felt a quiet understanding settle within him. His time as the guide of humanity was ending. He had given the people patterns to read the world. He had shown them how to write their thoughts so that memory could travel across generations. But the world still held other lessons, lessons rooted not in symbols or patterns, but in the living earth itself. Those lessons, he knew, would belong to another teacher, someone with a different spirit, someone whose strength would come not from patterns and symbols, but from soil, plants, and the hidden powers of the natural world. And so, without ceremony, Fuxi rose from the riverbank. He walked slowly back toward the villages. As he passed through the land, he saw fields where wild grasses had once grown unchecked. He walked along streets where children ran laughing beneath doorways carved with the earliest characters of written language. The people watched him pass with quiet respect. It was the kind of love reserved for those whose influence is so deep that their names will be spoken softly long after their bodies have returned to the earth. Eventually he disappeared from their sight, but the river continued speaking. The wind continued bending the reeds, and the 8 trigrams remained patiently waiting upon the diviner's mat, ready to answer questions for centuries yet to come. The land that would one day be known as China was still young, still nameless. But its people had learned something important. They had learned to live upright beneath heaven, while remembering that heaven itself follows laws that even kings cannot ignore. The rise of Shennong. After the long and quiet close of Fuxi's era, the responsibility of guiding humanity passed to another legendary ruler. His name was Shennong, the divine farmer. Where Fuxi had shaped human society, Shennong turned his attention toward the earth itself. The ancient stories describe him as a man with the broad shoulders of an ox and the patient spirit of fertile soil. He possessed immense physical strength, but even greater endurance of mind. Fuxi had taught humans how to live together without destroying one another. Shennong would teach them how to live with the land, because despite all the progress humanity had made, people were still vulnerable. A single failed harvest could bring famine. A harsh winter could erase years of work. Even a community governed by wise laws could not survive if nature itself refused to cooperate. Shennong understood that a civilization dependent only upon hunting or gathering would always live under the shadow of chance. If humanity hoped to build a lasting world, it would need to draw its strength directly from the soil. So he began with the most basic truth. The earth, if treated properly, could feed far more people than forests or rivers alone. Shennong walked tirelessly across valleys and plains, studying the landscape. He watched how water flowed during heavy rains and where the soil remained moist during dry seasons. He observed the direction of the wind and how sunlight touched the land at different times of year. From bentwood hardened in fire, he created the earliest forms of plows. These tools were simple, curved wooden frames strengthened with rope and tipped with sharpened stone. But they allowed humans to break the soil in ways never before possible. Holding the tool himself, Shennong demonstrated how to push it into the ground and turn the earth over so that its hidden nutrients could breathe again. Under his guidance, people planted crops deliberately rather than scattering seeds randomly. Millet, barley, rice. These grains were sown carefully in rows, giving each plant the space and nourishment it needed to grow strong. But Shennong never pretended farming was easy. He taught that agriculture required patience and discipline. Farmers learned to remove stones from the soil, to pull weeds before they strangled young plants, and to study the sky for signs of rain or drought. On steep hillsides, he instructed them to carve terraces, broad steps cut into the slopes so rainwater would nourish the fields rather than washing them away. In the valleys, he showed them how to dig irrigation channels that carried water to distant crops during dry months. Season after season, their labor slowly transformed the land. Fields that had once been wild grasslands began yielding waves of golden grain. For the first time in living memory, food stores lasted long enough to survive the winter months. Hunger did not disappear entirely, but it no longer ruled human life as it once had. And with food came stability. With stability came trade. Shinnong gathered scattered clans at crossroads where rivers met and mountain paths converged. There he established the first marketplaces. People arrived carrying baskets of grain, tools, dried meat, woven cloth, and jars of fermented millet wine. These markets soon became far more than places of trade. They became centers of culture. Stories traveled with merchants. Songs were exchanged along with goods. News spread quickly across the growing network of settlements. For the first time, people began to feel they belonged to something larger than their own village. They were part of a shared world. To help farmers understand the rhythm of nature more clearly, Shinnong introduced a system that divided the year into 24 solar terms, markers that tracked the sun's movement and the shifting breath of the seasons. With this knowledge, farmers could prepare their fields before the rains arrived and harvest crops before winter frost destroyed them. The earth remained powerful and unpredictable, but now humans stood before it as partners rather than helpless beggars. Within a few decades, the marks of Shinnong's work spread across the landscape. Terraced hills stepped toward the sky. Irrigation canals wound through valleys. Markets buzzed with life as voices mingled in growing towns. Yet even as the fields flourished, Shinnong saw another struggle waiting. Grain could feed the hungry, but it could not cure illness. Across villages, sickness continued to spread in quiet waves. Summer fevers weakened children. Strange berries and mushrooms poisoned the unwary. Winter coughs left the elderly gasping for breath. And spring brought insects whose bites carried unseen sickness into human blood. Tools could not fight these enemies. So Shinnong turned again to the natural world. If the earth could nourish life, he reasoned, it must also contain the power to heal it. Traveling alone through mountains and forests, he began studying plants. Wherever he found a new herb or root, he tested it himself. Sometimes he boiled it into tea. Sometimes he chewed it raw. Sometimes he crushed its leaves and smelled its fragrance. Many plants brought relief. Others were dangerous. Some burned his tongue. Some darkened his lips. Others sent waves of heat or cold rushing through his body. The legends say Shinnong possessed a transparent stomach made of crystal, so he could watch the path of each herb through his body. Whether truth or myth, one fact remains certain. He risked his own life for every discovery. Day after day he wandered the wilderness tasting roots, leaves, flowers, and fungi. Slowly he learned which plants healed wounds, which soothed fever, and which must be avoided entirely. From his knowledge came the earliest foundations of herbal medicine. People suffering from fever drank bitter teas. Wounded hunters were treated with herbal pastes. Smoke from certain dried leaves eased troubled breathing. Children who might have died survived. Hunters bitten by snakes returned to the forests. But the work carried a heavy cost. Many plants were poisonous. More than once Shinnong collapsed from their effects. And once, high in the western mountains, he tasted a plant whose venom spread through his body with terrifying speed. A cold fire raced through his veins. His legs failed beneath him, and he fell among the stones. The old stories tell that as Shinnong lay among the stones of the western hills, his strength fading and his vision growing dim, the wind itself seemed to stir with quiet purpose. A gentle breeze moved through the tall grasses and rustling leaves of the nearby plants. Among them stood a humble tree, whose leaves carried a bitterness few had yet discovered. As the wind shook its branches, several leaves broke free. They drifted downward through the air, like silent messengers of the earth. By chance, or perhaps by the quiet design of fate, they fell upon Shinnong's lips. With the last fragile strength remaining in his body, he chewed them. At first there was only bitterness, a sharp, cleansing taste that spread across his tongue. But then something remarkable happened. The poison that had begun to paralyze his body retreated like a defeated enemy. The burning in his veins cooled, and breath slowly returned to his lungs. Life, which had seemed ready to depart, turned back. Whether the tale is literal truth or the embroidery of generations who wished to honor their ancient king, the legacy it carries is undeniable. The plant that saved him would become one of his final gifts to the people. Tea, a drink to steady the body, a brew to clear the mind, a quiet companion to reflection and patience. In the centuries to come, it would warm countless hearths and accompany countless conversations, becoming as much a part of daily life as bread or water. But the tea plant was only one discovery among many. By the end of his long and dangerous search, Shennong had tested and cataloged hundreds upon hundreds of plants. He learned which bark could be boiled to release hidden strength, which leaves could be crushed to cleanse wounds, which roots could be steeped into tonics that restored vitality to the blood. These discoveries did not remain scattered fragments of knowledge. Shennong gathered them into a great body of learning. At first, the knowledge lived in memory, in the words spoken between teacher and student, healer and apprentice. But slowly it began to take shape as an organized record, a living catalog of the medicinal gifts of the earth. Within it were remedies for hunger, herbs to ease pain, roots to counter venom, and plants believed capable of calming the shadowed storms that sometimes overtook the human mind. With this knowledge, a new role emerged within the growing settlements. Healers, men and women who could step beyond the safety of the village, walk into the deep forests and wild valleys, and return carrying bundles of stems, dried blossoms, and twisted roots. In their hands, these humble plants became medicines. The sick who once would have been abandoned to fate now had hope. The wounded could heal. The weak could recover strength. The people lived longer lives than their ancestors had ever known. Under Shennong's rule, the earth itself had become both provider and physician. He was not a conqueror in the way later kings would be remembered. He commanded no vast armies, raised no towering fortresses, and sought no glory carved into monuments of stone. His authority came from something quieter and far more enduring. Proof. Before his time, the people had lived at the mercy of hunger and illness. After him, they possessed the tools to resist both. They knew how to cultivate the soil. They knew how to treat sickness. And so when Shennong finally passed from the world, the gifts he had given remained behind. The plow still turned the soil. The markets still rang with trade. The calendars still guided farmers through the turning seasons. And the leaves of healing plants still simmered in humble clay pots. Storms would still come. Drought would still strike. Death would still visit every family. But never again would humanity face those trials as helplessly as it once had. The rise of the Yellow Emperor. After Shennong's passing, the land he had nurtured did not collapse into ruin. His work had rooted itself deeply into the life of the people. Fields continued to produce grain. Markets continued to bind distant villages together. And healers continued their quiet journeys into forests and mountains in search of new cures. Yet the peace he left behind was delicate. The valleys and plains were filled with many clans. Each possessed its own traditions, its own leaders, its own pride. Without a single guiding figure to balance these differences, tensions slowly began to rise. Disagreements over hunting grounds turned into arguments. Arguments over rivers turned into skirmishes. And skirmishes, as they so often do, began to grow into wars. It was into this uncertain world that a new leader was born. His name would become one of the most revered in the entire history of China. Shenyuan Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor. But at the beginning, he was not yet a legend. He was merely one chieftain among many. He ruled a modest clan known as the Yoxiong, dwelling in the rugged hills of the northwest. His lands were not the richest, nor were his warriors the most numerous. Yet Huangdi possessed something few leaders of his age understood: patience. He was neither the tallest nor the strongest among the tribal chiefs, but he was perhaps the most observant. He watched carefully as neighboring clans rose and fell. He studied their victories and their mistakes. From these observations, he learned a truth many warriors never grasp. A tribe can win a battle and still lose the war if it wastes its strength. When news reached him that the Flame Emperor Yendi was pressing his claim over the fertile heartlands, Huangdi did not rush into battle. Instead, he measured the situation carefully. He gathered allies. Many smaller clans had grown weary of Yendi's growing dominance. Huangdi offered them partnership rather than submission. One by one, they joined him. The confrontation finally came at Banquan, a wide plain surrounded by low hills where rivers crossed the land like veins. The battle lasted for days. Dust filled the air. Spears splintered. War cries echoed across the valley. Neither side yielded easily. But Huangdi's careful preparation and disciplined command eventually won the field. Yet in victory, he made an unexpected choice. Rather than destroy Yendi completely, he offered peace. Not out of mercy, but out of vision. Huangdi understood something deeper than victory. A defeated rival could become a powerful ally. Yendi accepted the truce. Their clans united. Together they formed a coalition far stronger than either had been alone. And it was fortunate they did, because a far greater threat was rising: the warlord Chiyu. From the distant lands beyond the central plains came the warlord Chiyu, leader of the fierce Ninely tribes. Stories describe him as something more than human, a towering figure with the head of a bull and the body of living bronze. Some legends say weapons shattered against his skin. Others claim his strength was so immense that chains could not restrain him. Whether myth or truth, one fact was clear: Chiyu was terrifying. His warriors were disciplined, relentless, and unmatched in their mastery of metal. While other tribes fought with stone and bone, Chiyu's armies wielded forged blades and armored shields. They advanced like a storm across the land. Villages burned, clans scattered. Huangdi and Yendi both knew that if they faced this enemy alone, they would fall. Together they gathered every ally they could find. Warriors came from mountains, valleys, and distant river mouths. The final confrontation came at Zhuolu, a marshland where the ground itself threatened to swallow the feet of those who fought upon it. Chiyu's army arrived in numbers that darkened the horizon. Black banners rose above the mist, and in the early days of battle, victory belonged to him. Chiyu summoned a supernatural fog so dense that soldiers could not see their own comrades. Confusion spread across Huangdi's lines. Men struck down their own allies in the blindness. Panic began to take hold, but Huangdi had prepared for such chaos. From his engineers came a remarkable invention: the south-pointing chariot, a mechanical marvel whose inner gears ensured that a carved figure mounted upon it always pointed south, no matter how the vehicle turned. Using these chariots, Huangdi's commanders could guide their soldiers even through the thickest fog. Order returned to the battlefield. The coalition army advanced once more. Huangdi then summoned the warriors of the Xuannu tribe, fierce women whose drums and horns shook the air like thunder. Their sound shattered the rhythm of Chiyu's assault. In response, the warlord unleashed storms, winds and rain that turned the battlefield into chaos. But Huangdi had anticipated even this. He called upon the drought goddess Ba, whose presence drove away the storm clouds and stilled the rain. Above them all, the dragon Yinglong descended from the heavens, beating its wings to scatter the last of the suffocating fog. With the sky clear, the final clash began. Spears collided. Shields shattered. The marshland ran dark with blood. At the center of the battle stood Chiyu himself, cutting down every warrior who dared approach him. It required the combined strength of Huangdi's greatest champions to bring him down. When he was finally captured, the warlord roared with such fury that the earth itself seemed to tremble. Huangdi ordered his execution. He knew mercy in this moment would only invite further war. The victory at Zhuolu was absolute, but it had cost thousands of lives. For days the fallen lay upon the marsh until survivors could bury them. Yet from that terrible battlefield emerged something new. Huangdi was no longer merely a tribal leader. He had become the architect of a nation, the birth of a civilization. After Zhuolu, Huangdi began the work of shaping unity from chaos. He established laws to bind the clans together. He ordered roads built to connect distant territories. He invited craftsmen, inventors, and scholars to his court. Under his reign, new tools were forged. Stronger homes were built. Knowledge began to flow between once isolated communities. His queen, Lezu, discovered the secret of silk. Within her halls, the delicate threads of the silkworm were spun into fabric unlike anything the world had seen. Clothing became more than simple protection from the weather. It became a symbol of refinement and identity. Huangdi ruled for many decades. Through peace and hardship alike, he guided the realm with the same steady purpose. By the end of his life, tribes that once fought endlessly for land and water stood united beneath a single banner. Legend says he did not die as ordinary men do. Instead, a great dragon descended from the heavens, and Huangdi mounted its back, rising into the clouds until he vanished into the sky. Whether history or myth, his passing marked the end of an age. But the civilization he left behind was stronger than ever before, and it would soon face trials that even emperors could not command. From the rising heart of his new capital, the Yellow Emperor began the patient work of binding the scattered lands into something greater than a loose gathering of tribes. He understood that unity does not grow from victory alone. A battlefield can silence enemies for a moment, but only shared life can keep a realm together through the long turning of the years. So Huangdi turned his attention to the quiet architecture of civilization. Across hills once thought impassable and valleys that had long divided one clan from another, roads were carved into the earth. Workers cut pathways through forests, leveled stone paths across river plains, and built bridges where waters had once separated neighbors. These roads became the arteries of the new realm. Messengers rode along them day and night, carrying news from distant villages to the capital and returning with the emperor's commands. Through their journeys, the many scattered voices of the land slowly began to speak as one. Along these roads, life began to gather. Markets appeared where trade routes crossed. Traders from the mountains arrived with copper and rare herbs. Farmers from the plains brought carts filled with grain and millet. From the workshops overseen by the skilled weavers of Lezu, bolts of silk shimmered in the sunlight, their delicate threads representing a craft that would one day astonish distant civilizations. Trade was not merely an exchange of goods. It was the quiet weaving together of cultures. Songs traveled along these roads. Stories passed between villages. Customs began to blend and spread beyond the boundaries of their birth. In the years of relative peace that followed the victory at Zhuolu, invention flourished like wildflowers after rain. Huangdi welcomed into his court those whose minds held unusual skill. Metalworkers who could coax strength from fire and ore. Astronomers who studied the slow procession of the stars across the heavens. Artisans who experimented with the hidden forces of wind and flowing water. Within this gathering of minds, new ideas began to take shape. The bow was refined into a weapon of greater accuracy and strength. Farming tools were improved so that fields could be worked more efficiently. Builders developed stronger methods of construction, allowing homes and halls to stand firm against the changing seasons. Among these innovations came one of the most profound transformations in human history: writing. According to ancient tradition, it was during Huangdi's reign that the scholar Zhang, serving within the emperor's court, began to give form to written characters inspired by the patterns of nature. The shapes of bird tracks in the sand, the outlines of mountains against the sky, the flowing paths of rivers through the land. From these observations emerged symbols capable of preserving human thought. For the first time, records could be kept beyond the limits of memory. Agreements between clans could be written rather than merely spoken. The history of the realm could stretch beyond the fragile span of a single generation. Memory itself had found a body in ink and symbol. Music, too, was refined during this time. Instruments were tuned carefully to echo the rhythms of life. Songs for planting in the spring, melodies for harvest in the autumn, and solemn tones for the rituals that bound the people to heaven and earth. Even as peace nurtured art and knowledge, Huangdi never forgot the lessons written in blood upon the marshes of Zhuolu. He reorganized his armies with deliberate care. Warriors were trained in disciplined ranks rather than chaotic charges. Signal towers were raised upon high hills and along distant borders, allowing warnings to travel across the realm faster than any invading force. Yet the emperor did not hunger for constant war. Where possible, he sought peace through alliances and marriage rather than conquest. Former enemies were drawn into the growing structure of the realm, bound not by fear alone but by shared interest. Thus the empire deepened its roots. Years turned into decades. For many who lived through those days, the reign of the Yellow Emperor came to be remembered as a rare season of stability. An age when people who had once known only tribal conflict began to glimpse the possibility of lasting unity. But Huangdi himself understood something few rulers ever accept. Power cannot remain forever in one pair of hands. In his later years, he gradually withdrew from the daily burdens of rule, allowing younger leaders and heirs to learn the weight of command. He had never sought to create a world dependent solely upon him. Instead, he wished to leave behind a structure strong enough to endure even after his voice fell silent. He looked upon the realm he had shaped and saw something larger than a kingdom. He saw the first fragile outline of a nation, a people bound together not merely by blood or conquest, but by shared laws, shared crafts, and shared memory. When the final chapter of his life approached, legend began to wrap itself around his passing. Some said that a great dragon descended from the heavens before the gathered court, its scales shining like molten gold. The creature coiled around the emperor and carried him upward into the clouds, where he vanished beyond the sight of mortal eyes. Others claimed he walked alone into the distant mountains, disappearing into a veil of mist from which he never returned. However it truly happened, the people did not regard his departure as an ending. Instead, it became a transformation. The mortal ruler faded, and in his place remained a figure of eternal memory, an ancestor whose spirit would belong to the land forever. The banners of his clan were lowered in mourning, but the things he had built did not fade with him. The roads still carried travelers. The laws still guided the courts, and the unity he had forged continued to hold the many clans together. Yet even the strongest order cannot remain untouched by time. Beyond the borders of the realm, distant forces continued to shift, and within its growing lands, new ambitions quietly stirred. The age of Huangdi had been a foundation. What followed would test whether that foundation could endure. The age of Zhuanxu. After the passing of the Yellow Emperor, the realm he had built did not collapse as so many kingdoms do after the death of their founders. The roads he carved still bound the land together. Messengers continued to ride between distant provinces. Traders carried goods across valleys and rivers, just as they had in his lifetime. Most powerful of all was memory. The story of Zhuolu, the great victory over Qiyu, remained a shared legend among the clans. It reminded them that their unity had been forged through sacrifice and courage. But unity is a living thing. Left unattended, it slowly begins to fray. And in the years following Huangdi's departure, old rivalries began to stir again beneath the surface of peace. It was during this uncertain time that leadership passed to his grandson, Emperor Zhuanxu. Unlike his legendary grandfather, Zhuanxu was not known primarily as a warrior, nor was he a wandering teacher like Fuxi or Shinnong. His gift was colder, more strategic. He saw the realm not as a battlefield or a landscape, but as a vast web of relationships, alliances, obligations, and rivalries. If that web could be strengthened, the realm would endure. If it were left fragile, it would tear apart. He inherited a land that was rich but restless. New villages had spread across fertile valleys. Fields stretched farther into lands that had once been wilderness. Yet in the mountains and distant forests, smaller tribes still clung to older traditions. They spoke loyalty to the emperor, but their hearts did not always follow their words. Trade flowed along the rivers, but so too did whispers of rebellion. Zhuanqiu set himself to the quiet labor of binding these lands together through shared order. He began with ritual. Seasonal sacrifices to heaven, earth, and the spirits of grain and soil would no longer be performed according to local custom alone. Instead, they would follow a calendar maintained in the capital. Music too was standardized. The tones and scales used in ceremonies were fixed, so that the same songs could be recognized from the northern mountains to the southern plains. To an outsider, these changes might seem trivial, but Zhuanqiu understood something profound. A people who sing the same songs, pray on the same days, and honor the same rituals begin to see themselves as one people. Not merely a collection of tribes sharing land, but a civilization. He also reshaped the structure of family authority. In earlier generations, many clans had followed maternal lines of inheritance. Women preserved family memory and often determined alliances through marriage. Zhuanqiu altered this ancient custom. He established a patriarchal structure in which inheritance and leadership passed from father to son. The change was controversial. For many clans, it challenged traditions older than living memory. Yet over time, it created a clearer hierarchy of loyalty and succession, strengthening the political fabric of the growing realm. But Zhuanqiu's most radical act concerned something even greater than human society: the relationship between heaven and earth. In the earliest ages, the old stories say the boundary between the mortal world and the divine was thin. Gods, spirits, and strange beings could wander freely among humans. Some offered wisdom and protection. Others brought chaos and manipulation. Certain tribes, most famously the Miao, had learned to wield powerful magic, calling storms against their enemies or spreading illness through ritual curses. To Zhuanqiu, such power was dangerous. A world where spirits could interfere freely with human affairs was a world where no law could truly hold. So he made a decision unlike any ruler before him. He would separate the realms. He summoned 2 trusted ministers, Chong and Li, and charged them with sealing the ancient pathways between heaven and earth. The ladders of cloud, the sacred trees whose roots reached the underworld and whose branches brushed the sky. The hidden spirit roads known only to shamans. One by one, these connections were closed. Where once spirits could descend freely among mortals, there was now only distance. Where once humans might climb toward heaven, there was now silence. The decision caused sorrow. Shamans who had served as guides between worlds suddenly found themselves cut off from the voices they had known all their lives. Some feared humanity had lost a source of divine wisdom. But Zhuanqiu remained firm. In his mind, the world of men must be governed by the laws of men. When the work was complete, people said the sky itself seemed farther away. The stars appeared colder. Dreams became the only remaining path through which the divine might whisper to humanity. And even those messages were fleeting. The gods had not vanished, but they had become distant. And for the first time in memory, mankind stood truly alone beneath heaven, bound together not by divine command, but by the structures it had built with its own hands. With the pathways between heaven and earth finally sealed, the world slowly settled into a new and unfamiliar order. For the first time in living memory, humanity stood alone beneath the vast sky, without the constant presence of wandering immortals, spirits, or divine envoys who once moved freely between realms. At first, the change seemed peaceful. The skies remained still. No strange lights descended from the clouds at night. No mysterious visitors appeared in village markets offering riddles or wisdom in exchange for food and shelter. The mountains no longer echoed with rumors of creatures that carried the scent of another world. Yet the silence brought with it a strange and unsettling feeling. For generations, people had lived knowing that the divine was close, sometimes helpful, sometimes terrifying, but always present. Now that presence had vanished. Some felt abandoned by the heavens. Others feared something even worse, that the gods were angry, and that their return would come not as visitors, but as judgment. Among those most affected were the shamans and spirit speakers, who had once served as bridges between mortals and the unseen world. For them, the change was devastating. The voices they had once heard in dreams fell silent. Rituals that once brought visions now produced only empty smoke drifting into the wind. The old order had vanished, and in its place, a new one had to be built. Emperor Zhuanxu understood this danger better than anyone. If the gods would no longer enforce the balance of the world, then that responsibility would now fall entirely upon human hands. He realized that unity could not survive on memory alone. It required structure, laws, authority, and systems strong enough to replace what the heavens had once provided. So Zhuanxu began to reshape the empire. His rule was careful and deliberate. Rather than relying solely on powerful clans or ancient bloodlines, he strengthened the authority of the throne by appointing governors to oversee each province. These officials were chosen not only for their heritage, but for their ability to maintain peace, collect tribute fairly, and keep the loyalty of the people without driving them into rebellion. Across the realm, laws that had once differed from village to village were rewritten and unified. Messengers carried these new codes of law across mountains and rivers to the farthest settlements. For the first time, justice across the empire began to speak with a single voice. These laws were no longer mysterious commands claimed to come from spirits or divine messengers. They were the word of the emperor himself, clear, written, and enforced by the authority of the state. At the same time, Zhuanxu reorganized the system of tribute that bound the provinces together. Grain from fertile valleys, woven cloth from distant workshops, bronze tools from mountain forges, and livestock from open plains all flowed toward the capital. In return, the emperor distributed resources, protection, and imperial favor back to the regions that supported the throne. This exchange created something far more powerful than taxation. It created interdependence. Markets in remote provinces began to display goods from distant lands carried along the expanding network of imperial roads. A farmer in the far north might never see the emperor in person, but he would still feel the presence of imperial authority in his daily life. He would measure grain using weights stamped with the imperial seal. He would celebrate festivals held on the same day as those in the capital, and soldiers patrolling the roads would ensure that merchants and travelers moved safely through the empire. Slowly, the realm became more than a collection of tribes. It became a civilization. Yet Zhuanxu also knew that unity was fragile. Beneath the surface of peace, the memory of older traditions still lingered. In the southern mountains lived the Miao tribes, the same people whose misuse of spiritual powers had helped convince Zhuanxu that the gates of heaven had to be closed. Though cut off from the divine forces they once commanded, they continued to cling fiercely to their old customs and ancient gods. Their leaders spoke the emperor's name with formal respect, but their loyalty remained uncertain. Rather than sending armies to crush them, a war that could fracture the young empire, Zhuanxu chose patience. Envoys were sent carrying gifts, trade goods, and proposals of marriage alliances. Some tribal leaders accepted these offers, weaving their people slowly into the economic and political networks of the empire. Isolation gradually weakened. Trade replaced suspicion, and over time, the edges of the realm grew more secure. When Zhuanxu's long reign finally came to an end, he left behind a state far stronger than the one he had inherited. The provinces were governed by loyal officials. Roads and markets connected distant regions. Laws were understood across the land. But even the strongest order cannot control the forces of nature forever. In time, the throne passed to another ruler whose name would echo across history, Emperor Yao. Unlike the conquerors of earlier ages, Yao was remembered not for military glory but for wisdom, fairness, and humility. His court was not a place of extravagance, but of careful governance. People from across the land came seeking his judgment, clan leaders, farmers, craftsmen, and ministers alike. Under his guidance, disputes were settled fairly, lands were divided wisely, and the rhythms of agriculture were carefully aligned with the cycles of the heavens. Later generations would remember Yao's reign as a golden age, but it was an age forged through extraordinary trials. The first catastrophe came from the sky itself. According to ancient legend, the sun that lights our world today was once only one of 10 brothers, 10 fiery birds, each a three-legged crow that lived in the heavens. Each day, one sun would rise and cross the sky while the others rested, ensuring that the world received the proper balance of light and warmth. For ages, this sacred order was maintained, until one day something changed. Whether out of boredom, rivalry, or simple mischief, all 10 suns rose together. The result was disaster. The sky blazed with unbearable brightness. Rivers shrank into cracked channels. Forests smoldered beneath relentless heat. Crops withered in the fields, livestock collapsed in the shade, and people fell where they stood, their throats too dry even to cry for water. The world was burning. Faced with this catastrophe, Emperor Yao did not rely only on prayers. Instead, he summoned a legendary archer named Ho-I, whose skill with the bow was said to be unmatched anywhere under heaven. Ho-I arrived carrying a powerful bow carved from mulberry wood and arrows tipped with bright white feathers. Climbing to a high mountain peak, he first called out to the suns, begging them to return to their proper order. But the fiery birds only laughed, blazing brighter in defiance. Realizing that the world would perish if nothing was done, Ho-I drew his bow. The first arrow flew upward and struck one of the blazing crows, sending it crashing from the sky in a trail of smoke and fire. Then another, and another. One by one, 9 of the suns fell. Just as Ho-I prepared to shoot the last remaining sun, Emperor Yao raised his hand and stopped him. For the world could not survive in darkness. The final sun was spared, and it fled back into the heavens, forever bound to follow the proper path alone across the sky. The land was saved, but the damage lingered. It took years for rivers to swell again, for forests to regrow, and for the soil to recover its strength. As the world slowly healed from the fire, new dangers emerged. Wild creatures driven from their burned homes began roaming the countryside. Great serpents slithered through the plains, swallowing livestock whole, while monstrous beasts prowled the forests at night. Ho-I remained in the emperor's service, hunting these creatures and restoring safety to the land. Yet even as the scars of fire began to fade, an even greater disaster was approaching. It began with rain. At first, it seemed ordinary, steady seasonal storms filling the rivers and nourishing the crops. But the rains did not stop. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Rivers overflowed their banks and spread across the countryside. Villages fled to higher ground, only to find the waters rising behind them. The rain fell again the following year, and the year after that. Soon the land was transformed into a vast and endless flood. Fields disappeared beneath water. Entire valleys vanished. People survived on narrow strips of high ground, fishing from rooftops and traveling by raft between what remained of their homes. The empire itself began to unravel under the weight of despair. Determined to save his people, Emperor Yao gathered his wisest advisors. Together they agreed that the flood could only be defeated by a leader capable of commanding both the labor of men and the favor of heaven. Yao chose a man named Gun, a bold and ambitious noble descended from the ancient royal line of Zhuanxu. Gun believed the flood could be stopped by force. His plan was to construct massive walls and dikes to trap the rivers within their channels. To accomplish this, he sought a legendary substance called shirong, a magical soil said to grow endlessly once placed upon the earth. Whether granted by the gods or stolen from them, Gun acquired this miraculous material. With it, he built enormous embankments higher than any previously seen. For 9 long years he labored, but the rivers refused to obey. Water gathered behind the walls until the pressure became unstoppable. When the barriers finally broke, the resulting floods were even more destructive than before. Entire villages vanished in moments. Fields were stripped bare. The people began to lose faith, not only in Gun, but even in the emperor who had chosen him. The flood had become more than a disaster of water. It had become a disaster of hope. Seeing the failure, Emperor Yao understood that the struggle would outlast his own lifetime. So he turned his thoughts toward succession. Although he had sons of his own, Yao made a remarkable decision. Instead of passing the throne to his bloodline, he chose a man of humble origin named Shun, a farmer known across the land for his honesty, wisdom, and fairness. It was a decision that would shape the destiny of China for generations. Shun had not risen to prominence by chance. Long before he ascended the throne, he had already proven his worth through difficult and demanding responsibilities. He had overseen irrigation projects across troubled provinces and had been entrusted with settling bitter disputes between rival clans. In both tasks, he displayed a rare quality that few leaders possessed: the ability to inspire loyalty without relying on force. Men followed him not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in his fairness. Emperor Yao recognized this gift. As the great floods continued to swallow the land and Gun's efforts faltered, Yao understood that the realm would soon require new leadership capable of confronting challenges greater than any ruler had faced before. Rather than waiting for fate to decide the future, he made a deliberate choice. He elevated Shun to the role of co-ruler. In doing so, Yao hoped that the man he had chosen would succeed where others had failed, and that the terrible floods might finally be mastered in the next generation. During the final years of his life, Yao watched as Shun gradually assumed the burdens of governance. The young ruler proved calm under pressure, patient in judgment, and tireless in duty. Seeing this, Yao felt a quiet reassurance. When his time came to leave the world, he did so knowing that the realm was in capable hands. The floods still raged across the land, but hope had not disappeared. And so the golden age of Yao's reign, an era tested by both fire and water, came to its close not through collapse, but through the peaceful passing of responsibility to a worthy successor. Shun inherited a throne that stood in the midst of catastrophe. When he took power, much of the realm was still half drowned beneath the relentless floods that had begun during Yao's reign. The land itself bore the scars of years of destruction. Entire provinces had been reduced to scattered communities perched atop hills and ridges. Their once fertile fields lay hidden beneath a vast inland sea of murky water. Villages clung desperately to patches of high ground like barnacles on a stone. Narrow walkways made of logs and rope connected one refuge to another. Trade, once carried along roads bustling with carts and travelers, now moved slowly through flooded valleys and fragile boats. Many people navigated across the rooftops of submerged homes that still lay beneath the surface. Every day was measured by the constant roar of water rushing through valleys that had once been farmland. The air itself had changed. It carried the heavy smell of wet earth, rotting plants, and endless silt carried down from the mountains. Thick clouds hung low across the sky, and when the sun occasionally pierced the gray curtain above, its light seemed weak and distant, as if even it had grown weary of the endless storm. Shun inherited not only the throne, but also the greatest challenge any ruler had yet faced. His first task was to confront the legacy of Gun. For 9 long years, Gun had struggled to contain the floods by constructing massive embankments and towering dikes. Armed with the miraculous soil known as shirong, He had attempted to raise barriers strong enough to hold back the rising rivers. But the rivers had defied him. Instead of solving the crisis, his walls had turned the floods into something even more destructive. Water gathered behind the barriers until the pressure became unbearable. When they broke, the resulting torrents devastated entire regions in moments. The embankments were not protection. They were disasters waiting to happen. Yet Gunn remained stubbornly convinced of his own approach. His pride rose as high as the walls he had built, and even in failure he refused to surrender control. Shun summoned him to the imperial court and listened carefully as the aging engineer defended his actions. But in the end, the judgment was unavoidable. Gunn was stripped of his authority and exiled to Feather Mountain, far from the capital and the floodlands he had failed to tame. Legends offer different endings to his story. Some say the heavens themselves punished him, transforming his body into that of a yellow bear before he vanished into the misty wilderness. Others claim he simply wandered the mountains until age and sorrow claimed him. Whatever the truth, Gunn's fall was as complete as his failure. Shun did not immediately appoint another man who shared Gunn's thinking. He understood that repeating the same strategy would only repeat the same disaster. Instead, he turned to you, the son of the very man he had just exiled. You had grown up watching his father's relentless struggle against the rivers. But unlike Gunn, he had learned from those failures. During the years of construction, you had traveled widely across the floodlands as one of Gunn's assistants. He had personally observed how the rivers moved, how the waters rose in the rainy seasons, and how they sought paths through valleys and plains. From these observations, he reached a crucial conclusion. The flood could not be defeated by trying to imprison the rivers. Water would always find a way. Instead of forcing the rivers to obey, you believed they must be guided. Rather than fighting the waters, he would give them new paths to follow. Where Gunn had tried to command the rivers, you intended to negotiate with them. The task before him was enormous. This was not the flooding of a single river bursting its banks. Dozens of swollen waterways fed into one another, spreading across the land until it seemed as though the entire realm had become a flowing sea. You began near the capital, organizing thousands of workers to dig new channels and carve fresh paths through hills and valleys. But unlike many leaders, he did not remain in the safety of the palace while issuing orders. You worked beside the laborers. He stood waist-deep in mud, lifting stones, cutting through reeds, and guiding the placement of every trench and canal. His hands hardened with calluses like those of the workers around him. His dedication soon became the subject of legend. Ancient stories claim that during the 13 years you spent controlling the floods, he passed the doorway of his own home 3 separate times. Inside were his wife and children. Yet each time he refused to enter. He believed that resting in comfort while the people suffered would betray the duty he had accepted. So he continued walking. Gradually the work spread across the entire realm. You traveled constantly, studying the shape of the land itself. He examined mountain slopes, valleys, and plains, carefully recording where rivers swelled during spring floods and where they narrowed during dry seasons. At each location, he ordered new channels to be cut. Some guided floodwaters into natural lakes where they could be safely stored. Others redirected rivers into new courses that carried the water steadily toward the sea. He deepened river mouths so water could escape more quickly. Where hills blocked the natural flow, he ordered tunnels and passes carved through stone and earth. According to legend, Yu's mission was so vast that even the forces of nature seemed to assist him. Stories speak of a yellow dragon that helped tear open the earth with its claws, and a great black tortoise that carried stones used to strengthen the riverbanks. Whether these creatures were real or symbolic, one fact remains clear. Yu's work transformed the landscape of the entire realm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the flood began to retreat. Villages long buried beneath water emerged again from the mud. The rivers returned to defined channels instead of spreading across endless plains. Fields that had been abandoned for years were revealed beneath thick layers of fertile silt left by the floodwaters. When farmers returned and planted their crops, the soil proved richer than ever before. The smell of decay that had hung over the land for years was replaced by the scent of fresh grain and growing fields. The fear that had gripped the realm for so long began to fade. The rivers still swelled during heavy rains, but they no longer swallowed entire provinces. The great flood that had once seemed unstoppable was finally under control. Shun never claimed credit for this victory. Instead, he publicly honored Yu's achievements. Just as Emperor Yao had once elevated Shun himself, Shun now raised Yu to the position of co-ruler, sharing authority over the realm. Together they guided the empire through a remarkable recovery. Roads destroyed by floodwaters were rebuilt. Markets reopened across the provinces. Festivals returned to their proper seasons as the rhythms of life slowly normalized. Yet Shun remained cautious. He knew that peace could be dangerous if it allowed people to forget the hardships that had shaped them. He strengthened border defenses, resolved disputes between rival provinces, and ensured that tribute was collected fairly without burdening the people. Most famously, he banished the Four Fiends, corrupt lords whose cruelty had poisoned their regions, sending them into distant exile where they could no longer threaten the stability of the realm. The years of Shun and Yu's joint rule became known as a period not of conquest, but of reconstruction, a time when the empire was carefully woven back together. Eventually, Shun sensed that his own time was nearing its end. Like Yao before him, he refused to pass the throne to his own son simply because of blood. Instead, he followed the same principle that had guided the previous generation. The throne should belong to the most capable leader. And no man had proven himself more worthy than Yu, the engineer who had tamed the waters. When Shun died, his passing came quietly. There were no storms, no ominous signs in the heavens. The people mourned him as a ruler who had guided them through disaster with humility and wisdom. A man who had known when to carry the burden and when to pass it on. By the time Yu officially ascended the throne, the great flood had become a memory. The canals and channels he had carved across the land still shaped the river's paths, ensuring that the disaster would never again reach such devastating scale. But Yu did not view the flood as a problem solved by royal decree. For him, it had been a personal journey, a long march across the realm that had taken him from the icy headwaters of the mountains to the muddy mouths where the great rivers met the sea. During that journey, he had developed a new kind of leadership. He surrounded himself not with flattering courtiers, but with practical men, surveyors, engineers, and laborers who understood the land through experience rather than ceremony. Together they walked the flood-scarred landscape, studying slopes, currents, and soil. They marked the earth with ropes and stakes, identifying where water could be guided towards safer paths. You spoke with village elders who remembered how the ground behaved during spring floods. He listened to farmers and travelers who knew where water pooled and where the land naturally drained. Using reeds and bark as makeshift writing materials, he recorded everything. Slowly, these notes formed something extraordinary. A map, not just of rivers, but of survival itself. And from that map, the future of the realm would be built. With the pathways that once bridged heaven and earth now sealed, the world gradually settled into a quieter and unfamiliar order. The age in which divine beings wandered freely among mortals had come to an end. No longer would spirits descend from the clouds to test the wisdom of farmers or speak riddles in the marketplaces. No longer would celestial creatures slip from the mountains carrying the scent of realms beyond human reach. At first, the land felt strangely calm. The sky no longer shimmered with unexplained lights drifting downward in the night. The temples grew quieter, their priests left to tend empty altars. The forests held no whisper of immortal footsteps. But this quiet was not entirely comforting. For generations, people had lived under the shadow, and sometimes the guidance of divine powers. They had seen gods punish arrogance and reward virtue. They had watched shamans summon unseen forces and spirit talkers interpret the will of heaven. Now all of that was gone. Some believed the gods had abandoned humanity entirely. Others feared something far worse, that the gods had only withdrawn temporarily, watching from afar, waiting for a reason to return in anger. The shamans who once spoke confidently with spirits now found themselves uncertain. Their rituals produced silence. Their dreams brought no visions. And in that silence, a dangerous question began to grow. If the gods were no longer here to enforce order, who would? Xuanzhu understood that such a void could not remain open for long. Without structure, fear would turn into chaos, and chaos would tear the realm apart. If heaven would no longer rule the earth, then the responsibility must fall upon men. And so Xuanzhu turned his mind not toward war or conquest, but toward something far more enduring, the creation of a stable and unified system of law. He began to weave together a structure of governance that could replace the vanished ladders to heaven. His rule became deliberate and methodical. The provinces, once loosely bound to the throne through shifting loyalties and ancient clan traditions, were reorganized and strengthened. Governors were appointed directly by the emperor. They were chosen not simply for noble birth or powerful lineage, but for their ability to maintain peace, resolve disputes, and gather tribute without driving their people toward rebellion. Local customs still existed, but the laws of the empire would now be the same everywhere. Where once each clan followed its own traditions, written laws were now carefully recorded and carried by imperial messengers across the land. These laws were written clearly, so that even distant villages would understand the rules that governed them. They were no longer whispers of divine instruction. They were the voice of the emperor himself, and that voice carried authority. Xuanzhu also reformed the system of tribute that tied the provinces to the imperial center. Tribute was no longer merely a display of wealth or submission. It became part of a vast economic network that bound the entire realm together. From distant provinces came grain, cloth, metals, and crafted goods. In return flowed imperial protection, infrastructure, and access to trade. Roads connecting the outer provinces to the capital were repaired and expanded. Along these roads traveled not only imperial decrees but merchants, travelers, scholars, and storytellers. Markets began to fill with goods that had once seemed impossibly distant. A farmer in the northern hills might never see the emperor's face, yet he could feel the reach of imperial authority in subtle ways. In the weights stamped with the imperial seal, in festivals celebrated on the same calendar as the capital, and in patrols that kept trade routes safe from bandits. Slowly, an invisible web of order stretched across the land. Yet even as the realm grew more stable, Xuanzhu knew that not every corner of the empire accepted this new order. In the southern mountains lived the Miao tribes, people whose connection to ancient spiritual forces had once been powerful. Their misuse of those forces had helped drive Xuanzhu to seal the pathways between heaven and earth. Now cut off from the divine energies they once commanded, they struggled to preserve their old traditions. Their leaders continued to whisper the names of spirits that no longer answered. They followed their own laws and honored their own gods. Xuanzhu could have marched against them with armies and fire, but he knew that war in the mountains would bleed the empire and deepen their resistance. Instead, he chose patience. Envoys were sent bearing gifts, trade goods, and promises of alliance. Marriages were arranged between tribal leaders and noble families of the empire. Trade routes slowly connected the mountains to the wider world. Little by little, isolation gave way to cautious cooperation. When the reign of Jehoan Shu eventually came to an end, the realm he left behind stood stronger than it had ever been. Its borders were guarded by loyal governors. Its roads connected distant provinces. Its markets flourished. Order had taken root, but history rarely allows peace to last forever. In time, the throne passed into new hands, and eventually it came to a ruler whose name would echo across centuries, not as a conqueror or warlord, but as the model of a just and virtuous king. That ruler was Yao. Yao's court was not famous for dazzling luxury or extravagant ceremonies. Instead, it became known for careful governance and thoughtful decisions. People sought Yao's judgment not only for matters of law, but also for disputes between clans, the division of farmland, and even the setting of the calendar that guided planting and harvest. Under his leadership, the empire experienced what later generations would remember as a golden age. But this golden age was not born in comfort. It was forged in trials that might have destroyed weaker rulers. The first of these trials came from the heavens themselves. In ancient times, the sun that lights the sky today was not alone. According to legend, 10 suns existed, 10 radiant brothers, each taking the form of a three-legged crow of fire. Each day, only one would cross the sky while the others rested beyond the horizon. Their careful rotation gave the world its balance of warmth and light. For countless years this order held. Then one morning something went terribly wrong. Whether from boredom, rivalry, or reckless curiosity, the 10 suns rose together. The sky erupted in unbearable brightness. The combined heat scorched the earth. Rivers dried into cracked beds of mud. Forests began to smoke and burn. Fields withered beneath the relentless blaze. Livestock collapsed beneath sparse patches of shade. People fell where they stood, their throats too dry even to cry out for water. Yao did not face this catastrophe with prayers alone. Across the empire, he sent urgent summons for a legendary archer whose skill was said to rival the forces of nature itself. His name was Hou. Hou arrived at the imperial court carrying a great bow carved from mulberry wood and a quiver of arrows tipped with brilliant white feathers. He climbed to the highest peak he could find and called out to the suns, begging them to return to their rightful order. But the fiery birds ignored him. They laughed in the sky, their blazing wings scorching the mountaintops. Seeing that mercy would not move them, Hou placed the first arrow upon his bowstring. He released it. The arrow streaked upward like lightning. One of the suns fell from the sky in a trail of flame and smoke. Then another, and another. One by one, 9 of the blazing crows were struck down. When Hou lifted his bow to shoot the final sun, Emperor Yao himself stepped forward and stayed his hand. For without at least one sun, the world would fall into eternal darkness. Hou lowered his bow. The final sun fled across the sky, humbled and alone, returning to the path it still follows today. The land was saved, but the damage lingered. Rivers needed seasons to recover. Fields needed years before crops could grow again. And soon, new dangers emerged from the chaos the disaster had left behind. Creatures driven from burned forests wandered the countryside. Giant serpents lurked near rivers. Beasts with claws like bronze stalked the night. Hou continued to serve the emperor, hunting many of these monsters and restoring safety to the countryside. Yet an even greater disaster was already gathering. At first it began with heavy rain, then more rain, then rain that seemed endless. Rivers overflowed their banks. Villages abandoned low ground and fled toward the hills. But the waters followed. The rains did not stop when the seasons changed. They did not stop the following year, or the year after that. The rivers merged into a vast and unstoppable flood that swallowed valleys, plains, and entire provinces. People survived on narrow ridges of high ground. They traveled by rafts across what had once been farmland. The order that Yao had worked so carefully to build began to crumble beneath despair. Realizing the danger, Yao gathered his wisest advisors. They agreed that only a leader of immense determination could overcome such a catastrophe. That leader would need the strength to command thousands of workers, and perhaps even the favor of heaven itself. Yao chose a man named Gun. Gun was ambitious, confident, and descended from the ancient royal line of Shuanggu. His plan was bold. He believed the flood could be contained by constructing enormous walls and dikes, forcing the rivers back into their channels. To achieve this, he sought a miraculous substance known as shirang, a magical soil said to grow endlessly and repair itself. With this strange material, Gun built embankments higher than any the people had ever seen. For 9 long years the work continued. Wall upon wall rose across the flooded land, but the waters did not yield. Instead they gathered behind the barriers, growing heavier and more dangerous. And when those barriers finally broke, the destruction was worse than before. Villages vanished beneath waves. Fields were stripped bare. Faith in Gun, and even in Yao's decision, began to crumble. The flood had become not only a disaster of water, but a disaster of hope. And Yao knew that the task might outlast his own lifetime. So he turned his thoughts toward the future. Though he had sons of his own, he chose not to give them the throne. Instead, he selected a man of humble birth whose reputation for honesty and fairness had spread throughout the empire. That man was Shun. The realm that you now ruled was not held together merely by roads, decrees, or the authority of a distant throne. It was bound by something far stronger, the shared memory of struggle and the shared labor that had saved it. Every province, every village, every field carried within it the story of the years when the waters had risen and threatened to erase the land itself. And it was through the hands of thousands working together that the flood had finally been subdued. You understood that such unity was rare in the history of kingdoms. Many rulers inherited order that had been built by their ancestors. Few had the opportunity to shape a new one from the ruins of catastrophe. He resolved that the unity forged in mud, sweat, and hardship would not fade into memory. Instead, it would become the foundation of a new structure of governance, one strong enough to endure long after his own lifetime had passed into legend. His first concern was the very shape of the realm. Before the flood, the land had been divided largely by tribe and lineage. Clans had claimed valleys and plains as their own, guarding them fiercely against outsiders. Boundaries were marked not by rivers or mountains, but by bloodlines and old rivalries. Such divisions had endured for generations, yet you had witnessed how fragile they truly were. When the waters rose, the rivers did not care which clan controlled which valley. Floods swept across ancestral borders as easily as wind crosses open fields. In those desperate years, cooperation had often meant survival, while isolation had led to ruin. You resolved that the old arrangement could no longer remain. Instead of organizing the land according to tribal claims, he redrew the realm according to the natural order of the earth itself. He divided the kingdom into 9 great provinces, each shaped by its rivers, its soil, its mountains, and its plains. Their names reflected the character of the lands they contained, some rich with fertile valleys, others marked by rugged highlands or broad river basins. This was far more than the decision of a cartographer. It was a new philosophy of rule. You believed that governance should grow from an understanding of the land itself. Rivers determined where crops could grow. Mountains shaped travel and trade. Rainfall decided which villages thrived and which struggled. To govern well, a ruler had to understand not only the people, but the earth beneath their feet. Within each province, you appointed officials who were chosen not for their loyalty alone, but for their fairness, intelligence, and practical skill. Their duties were clear. They were to maintain the network of canals and channels that kept the rivers in balance. They were to settle disputes between farmers over water and land. They were to collect tribute without cruelty or greed, for you understood that tribute itself was a delicate matter. In years of abundance, a portion of the harvest could be sent to the capital without hardship. But in lean years, demanding the same share would breed resentment and rebellion. So the system was designed to bend with the fortunes of the land. You did not rely solely on reports carried by messengers. He traveled constantly throughout the provinces, often arriving with little ceremony. He wished to see the land as it truly was, not as officials described it. He walked fields where farmers bent over plows. He listened to the sounds of markets crowded with merchants and craftsmen. He watched the people themselves. Sometimes he dressed simply, without imperial robes, speaking with villagers who did not immediately recognize the man before them as their ruler. From these journeys, he learned far more than numbers and reports could reveal. He learned how the soil felt beneath the blade of the plow. He learned whether market stalls were full or sparse. And perhaps most importantly, he learned how people spoke about their governors when they believed no noble ears were listening. During these travels, you also began collecting the traditions and stories of the people. He understood that a kingdom could not be united by laws and taxes alone. True unity required something deeper. A shared identity that allowed people from distant regions to feel they belonged to the same realm. In the southern provinces, he witnessed festivals filled with dances honoring the dragon kings who ruled the rivers. In the northern hills, he heard ancient songs sung by hunters who traced their lineage to the first tribes that had followed elk across mountain passes. In the central plains, he watched traveling performers reenact the story of the Great Flood itself, telling of the years when the waters had nearly consumed the world, and of the long struggle that had finally brought them under control. You encouraged these traditions, for he understood that stories bind people to their past just as surely as canals bind rivers to their channels. Yet even in this new era of stability, harmony did not come without challenges. The wealth that began to flow through the provinces inevitably attracted those who wished to seize more than their share. Banditry returned along certain trade routes. In distant borderlands, ambitious warlords sought to test the strength of imperial authority. In the far west, a coalition of dissatisfied chiefs refused to pay tribute altogether. They claimed that Yu's new provinces had erased their ancestral rights and ignored the authority of ancient clan leaders. Yu did not rush immediately to war. Instead, he sent envoys carrying clear messages. They spoke plainly of what the empire required, but also of what it offered in return: protection, trade, and stability. Some chiefs accepted these terms willingly. Others did not. When the envoys were answered with raids and attacks on villages, Yu finally acted. But even then, he did not march with a vast army meant to destroy entire regions. Instead, he sent swift, disciplined companies of soldiers who moved like the rivers themselves, flowing quickly where the enemy was weak, cutting off supply lines, isolating rebellious strongholds. The strategy worked. Most of the rebellious chiefs chose submission rather than starvation. Those who surrendered were allowed to keep their lands, but now they ruled under the same laws as every other province. In this way, Yu's reign came to be known for a rare balance between strength and restraint. He possessed the authority of a hero who had saved the realm from destruction, yet he used that authority sparingly. Whenever possible, he persuaded rather than compelled. His justice became widely respected. When disputes arose between provinces, Yu often heard the cases personally. He listened patiently to both sides before delivering judgments that left little room for doubt. Favoritism did not sway him. Cruelty did not tempt him. Over time, the people came to know him not only as the man who had tamed the flood, but as the ruler who governed according to the natural balance of the land itself. Even as harvests grew plentiful and markets overflowed with grain, Yu never forgot how quickly fortune could change. He strengthened the system of granaries that had first been created during the flood years. In every province, large storage houses were built to hold surplus grain. These reserves ensured that in years of drought, storms, or poor harvests, the people would not face starvation. He also ordered forests replanted along hillsides where erosion threatened the soil. The headwaters of major rivers were protected, so that overuse would not weaken the delicate balance that kept floods under control. To Yu, good rule meant more than responding to disasters. It meant preventing them whenever possible. In the quiet evenings of his later years, Yu sometimes walked beside the canals he had once dug with his own hands. The raging torrents of his youth had become calm waterways lined with reeds and moss. Fishermen cast their nets into waters that had once threatened entire provinces. Children played in fields that had been buried beneath 10 feet of floodwater when Yu himself had been young. He knew that one day his own life would fade into legend, just as the lives of Yao and Shun had before him. But what he had built was not merely a story. It was a living system, an intricate balance of land, water, and people working together. And it was this system, more than any heroic tale, that he hoped would endure. The later years of Yu's reign were marked by a quiet stability, not the stillness of neglect, but the steady rhythm of a kingdom that had finally found balance. The flood had been conquered. The provinces had been defined. The laws had been tested and refined. Yet Yu understood that peace required constant attention. Even calm rivers must be watched, for unattended waters can turn stagnant. The canals required regular maintenance. Officials required oversight, and the unity between the 9 provinces had to be nurtured continually. So Yu continued to travel across the land, not as a desperate leader battling disaster, but as a careful steward tending a vast garden. Wherever he went, he inspected the rivers, tasted grain at markets, and listened to elders speak about the conduct of their governors. He had little patience for arrogance among his officials. More than once, a corrupt governor was stripped of his title and sent back to the fields he had neglected, forced to labor beside the very people he had once ruled. Yet Yu's wisdom extended beyond discipline. He knew that unity could not survive forever on the memory of the flood alone. Memories fade as generations pass, so he began to strengthen bonds between the provinces in new ways. Craftsmen, farmers, and scholars were encouraged to travel and exchange knowledge across the realm. A potter from the eastern provinces might spend years teaching his craft in the highland villages. A farmer from the north might journey south to learn new techniques for cultivating rice. These exchanges created connections deeper than law. When a man looked at the goods in his local market, he no longer saw the work of strangers. He saw the work of neighbors, people he had met, traded with, or learned from. In governance, you balance central authority with respect for local traditions. While the imperial throne set the great laws that held the realm together, each province retained its own customs, festivals, and rituals. The empire was not a rigid block of stone. It was a mosaic, each province distinct, yet together forming a greater whole. Even so, the peace you had created was not entirely free from challenge. In the far northeast, nomadic tribes suffering from famine after a brutal winter began raiding border villages. You did not immediately send armies to destroy them. Instead, he sent envoys carrying grain and salt. They offered the tribes a choice: join the order of the 9 provinces, settle the land, and share in its prosperity. Some accepted. They became new citizens of the realm. Those who rejected the offer and continued their raids faced a different response. Yu's forces moved swiftly, breaking their camps and seizing their herds as restitution. His rule always followed the same principle: offer the open hand first. But if the hand was rejected, the closed fist would follow without hesitation. As the years passed, people across the land began speaking of Yu the Great not merely as the hero who had conquered the flood. They began to speak of him as something even greater, the founder of a dynasty. As the years of Yu's reign drew toward their final chapter, the court began to press him with a question that had lingered in quiet whispers for some time. Who would rule after him? In the age of the sage kings, the answer had once been clear. The throne had not belonged to bloodlines, but to virtue. Long before Yu's rise, the legendary rulers Yao and Shun had chosen their successors not from among their sons, but from among the most worthy men in the realm. Wisdom and ability had weighed more heavily than lineage. Many believed that this tradition was part of the sacred order of heaven itself. Yet the world had changed since those earlier days. Yu's court, ministers, generals, and provincial governors began urging him toward a different path. They argued that the stability he had built required continuity. The realm was vast now, its provinces connected by canals, roads, and laws that had grown under his leadership. To pass the throne to an outsider, even a capable one, might risk division. Better, they said, for the mantle of rule to remain within the house that had restored the land. You listened to their counsel with care, yet he hesitated, for he knew well the ancient teaching, that the mandate of heaven rested not upon blood, but upon virtue. If a ruler grew corrupt or weak, heaven could withdraw its favor. The throne was not meant to be inherited like a field or a house. Still, as he watched the years pass, you also watched his son Qi grow into maturity. Qi had been raised in the shadow of extraordinary expectations. From childhood, he had heard the stories of the Great Flood and the labors that had saved the land. He had walked the canals with his father, seen the great granaries filled, and listened to the judgments delivered in the imperial court. He had not grown into a weak prince. Instead, he became a man of skill, discipline, and command. Gradually, you began to believe that perhaps the realm had reached a new stage in its life. The chaos of earlier ages had given way to order. The provinces were established. The laws were written. The channels that governed the rivers had become part of the land itself. Perhaps now the throne could pass from father to son without breaking the balance that heaven required. And so you made a decision that would shape the future of China for thousands of years. He named Qi as his heir. With that choice, the age of chosen sage rulers quietly gave way to something new: hereditary kingship. The throne would no longer pass only to the most virtuous man in the realm. It would pass through blood from father to son. What began as a practical decision would echo through centuries, marking the birth of dynastic rule. In the final season of his life, Yu's strength slowly began to fade. The man who had once walked the length of the flooded land no longer traveled the great circuits of inspection that had defined his earlier years. Instead, he spent more time within the capital, surrounded by ministers and scholars who recorded the lessons of his reign. Yet even as age weighed upon him, he did not entirely abandon his old habits. He still walked beside the nearest rivers, leaning upon a carved staff as he studied the currents. He still visited the granaries during harvest, speaking with farmers and overseers about the condition of the crops. To the end of his days, the land remained his greatest concern. When death finally came, it arrived quietly. There were no storms, no omens in the sky, no earthquakes or darkened suns. Yu died much as he had lived, calmly, with his affairs in order and his work completed. The realm he left behind stood in peace. The 9 provinces remained bound together by the rivers he had guided, the canals he had carved, and the laws he had set into motion. The habit of unity that had grown during his reign continued to shape the lives of the people. When news of his death spread across the land, mourning came not with panic or fear for the future. Instead, it came with gratitude. In distant villages, elders gathered children around evening fires and told them of the time when the waters had covered the land. They spoke of the man who had walked through mud and storm to tame the rivers themselves. In the provinces, governors ordered the clearing of canals and the inspection of dikes in his honor, continuing the very work that had made the kingdom possible. And in the capital, he was laid to rest beneath a great earthen mound shaped like a gentle hill. It was said that the burial mound resembled the natural rise of the land itself, as though the earth had lifted its own body to shelter the ruler who had shaped it. His name would endure in the histories, not as a conqueror of armies, not as a builder of grand palaces, but as something rarer, a conqueror of chaos. He was remembered as the ruler who had reshaped the bones of the land and given his people the knowledge to master it. With his passing, the age of the sage kings, Yao and Shun, came to its quiet end. In its place began a new chapter in the story of the Middle Kingdom, a chapter in which the throne would pass from father to son. a chapter in which the rivers would continue to follow the courses he had carved, and a chapter in which the memory of the great flood would remain, not as a source of fear, but as a lesson in the power of human effort. Yet the story of China did not begin with you. It stretched far deeper into the mist of myth and memory. From the earliest beginnings, when the world itself was said to be a swirling chaos of shadow and light, through the birth of heaven and earth, through the rise of the first sovereigns who ruled not through force, but through the moral gravity of their virtue, the legends of Chinese mythology formed a vast tapestry where history and myth were woven together. In those earliest ages, gods and mortals were said to walk the same paths. Their voices echoed in the same halls. Their conflicts shaped the fate of the world itself. The story began with Pangu, who split the primal chaos to separate heaven from earth. It continued with Nüwa, who repaired the broken sky and shaped humanity from clay. Later came the great sovereigns who struggled to impose order upon a turbulent world. There was Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, who forged unity among the warring tribes. Then Zhuanxu, who sealed the road between heaven and earth so that humankind might learn to govern itself. Then Shun, who judged men not by birth but by virtue. And finally Yu, who bent his entire life toward taming the waters that threatened to drown the land. These figures were not mere decorations on painted scrolls. They were remembered as men who carried the weight of entire worlds upon their shoulders. Their decisions shaped the fate of countless generations. Somewhere along this long road, myth slowly turned into history. There was no single moment when the gods vanished. Rather, their voices grew quieter. The spirits that once walked openly among men retreated into temples and legends. Rulers were no longer chosen by visions from the heavens, but by the inheritance of blood. Yet the ancient world never disappeared entirely. The rivers still flowed along the courses you had carved. Mountains still held temples dedicated to the first gods. And the people continued to tell stories of the time when heaven once leaned close enough to touch the earth. Every dynasty that followed drew strength from these origins. Each claimed the mandate of heaven, speaking of it as a sacred flame passed from the first dawn of creation through every ruler who had come before. Thus the chaotic beginnings of the world slowly gave way to rhythm. The provinces cultivated their fields, markets filled with goods from distant regions, and the capital grew into a city whose foundations were built not only of stone, but of memory. The rulers who came after you would fight wars, raise palaces, and carve monuments meant to outlast the centuries. Yet somewhere within their halls there was almost always an image of the ancient flood, and of the man who had stood against it. For it was in the age of the flood's taming that the Middle Kingdom learned one of the deepest truths of all its myths. That order is never permanent, that each generation inherits both the gifts and the burdens of those who came before, and that the greatest power in the world is not found in the sword, nor even in the crown, but in the patient shaping of the world so that it may endure. And so the story ends where it was always meant to end, not among distant heavens, not in the shadowed depths of myth, but here upon the living earth, among the people who walk its soil. The rivers keep to their courses, the fields yield their harvests, and the stories continue to be told beside firelight beneath the same moon that once shone upon Pangu, Nüwa, Huangdi, and Yu. Within those stories the gods walk again, the emperors rule again, and the land itself is forever reborn in the telling.